Good morning, everyone. You are the survivors. You made it through the wild, raucous party last night. I guess that's kind of what it was. I am Jeremy Kelley. I'm a senior program manager with the OneDrive and SharePoint developer platform team. I'm generally responsible for all of the APIs that SharePoint and OneDrive have. We focus mainly on Microsoft Graph nowadays, but we do include things like CSOM and the SharePoint REST APIs. So quite a big area. And today we're going to talk about Microsoft Graph. We're going to talk about some of the new things we have coming, as well as some application best practices and a whole lot of demos. So thank you all for being here this morning. I know it's the last day and everybody's kind of feeling the end of the conference. So we're going to jump right in. How many people were here for our pre-day workshop on Monday? Only a couple. That's great, because then most of you won't be disappointed at a couple repeat slides. And for those that were here on Monday, we're going to do mostly new stuff. And so I promise, even if it seems familiar at first, we're going to get past that pretty quick. So we're going to talk about what Microsoft Graph is and what it means for OneDrive and SharePoint. We're going to go over a couple different topics for best practices, things you should keep in mind as you develop against our APIs. And then we're going to talk about some of the new stuff, particularly how to find site collections, because that's always been a persistent problem, and we have some good news there. How to get notified when changes are happening in your system. So we're going to talk about webhooks and that model. We're going to find out how to determine what changed. So we're going to look at the Delta query API and what that can do for you and some of the new capabilities that are there. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time at the end on what I'm calling integrated experiences. So how you can bring your apps into the SharePoint world, how you can bring the OneDrive and SharePoint world into your apps, and all still backed by Microsoft Graph. So meet the Microsoft Graph giraffe. Apparently his name is Giraffe. I did not create him, but he is the new mascot for Microsoft Graph. If you find Jeremy Thake at the conference, he might have these stickers still available. For those that aren't super familiar, Microsoft Graph is our common API endpoint. So in the past, you always had to download different SDKs, remember different endpoints to talk to the different services. If I wanted Exchange data versus SharePoint data, they were different libraries, different endpoints, and I had to manage all of that myself in the application I was writing. Microsoft Graph brings that together. So graph.microsoft.com is the common endpoint for all of the different services that I might want to talk to. And that brings with it a unified app authentication model using the recently GA'd MSAL, Microsoft Authentication Library. And that really lets you do one auth call to get a token for all the different things that your app needs to do, and makes it super easy to actually get auth working. So we're not even going to spend a lot of time on it in our demos today. In the past, we have spent like half of our time talking about how you get the thing to just work. We're not going to do that today because it's gotten easy enough that I think you can go and look at more samples if you need to as you're building your app. Additionally, we leverage Microsoft Azure application registration for apps that talk to Graph. So when you go to portal.azure.com, you can register an application that gives you an app ID that is your unique identifier for your app. You'll always pass that back with the calls you make. It's part of the auth token that comes back. And so that makes identifying your app very easy. It helps with the auth layer. It also helps us with telemetry on the back end. So we're able to kind of see what apps are doing, and when you have an issue and reach out to us, that helps us be able to look up what might be going on. One of the great features that kind of fits in the Graph ecosystem is Graph Explorer. Graph Explorer is a web app that allows you to try out the Graph APIs without having to do any application development. It lets you pick a sample, it will show you the endpoint that you're hitting for that, and then show you the JSON result that comes back. And you can use that either with a free sample data set that we have configured, or you can sign in either with your tenant credentials or with a Microsoft personal account to be able to simulate those calls against your own data set. All of the graph information is available at aka.ms/MicrosoftGraph or graph.microsoft.com, whichever one is easier for you to remember. In terms of OneDrive and SharePoint, most of what we do falls under one of two spots. If you're looking for OneDrive information, it's going to be under drives. The most common being /me/drive, which returns you the current logged in user's OneDrive for Business pointer. And /drives is kind of the global entry point for all of those OneDrive for Business drives. And for other SharePoint site data, they all live under /sites. So sites is the home of your site collection information, and that then houses all of the list and document library data that you have. Document libraries get to be a special case because they are both lists in the SharePoint world and drives because they contain files. So you'll find yourself using both of those APIs in order to interact with file data depending on what you want to do. We'll see that a little bit in some of our demos. Things that are fairly recent into the world of Graph for OneDrive and SharePoint. We've talked in the past about analytics APIs. We've now made the first two of these, which are all-time data or last 7 days worth of data for individual file items or site collections. Those are now available as at the 1.0 endpoint. They were beta for quite a while, and they've recently been published up to 1.0. For webhooks, webhooks have been available for a long time. We recently added the ability to get webhook notifications when ACLs change on an item in SharePoint. So previously, you would get webhooks on things like file create, file delete. Now you can pass in a preference header when you subscribe to webhooks that will actually let you get notified when the permissions change. So there are a fairly broad class of applications that need to know what the current state of permissions are. And this new header for the webhooks will let you get that information and be able to scan efficiently. Delta API is another one that's been around for a while, but we've been working on it. So you can now request to have an annotation added that indicates that something appeared in the Delta API because its permissions changed. You can sense a theme here with permissions in a lot of the work we've been doing because it's been a problem spot and we really want to make that work. So this new annotation will let you know that you might need to go ask for the permissions for an individual item because they changed, as opposed to always scanning for them, which can get very expensive. And we'll talk a little more about Delta coming up. And these last two I'm actually really excited to talk about because they solve a big problem, and I alluded to it earlier that there's a section on finding sites. So we have two APIs that are going to be coming into beta very soon. One is the followed sites API. This lets you work with the followed set for a given user. So you may have a scenario where as an IT organization, you want to bootstrap users coming into your organization with a set of sites that they need to follow. Or you might just be building an interactive scenario where you want to pick from the set of sites that a user is following if you're building a Webpart. And we'll see more of that in the demos. But that's a great scenario that we're now enabling. And site collection enumeration. How many people have ever tried to get the list of site collections in your tenant? A few. The answer is you've tried, but it's unlikely that you were completely successful or reliable. We are fixing that. This has been a long-standing problem in SharePoint that the list simply didn't exist. And so we're introducing an API that will allow you to get all of your site collections, including OneDrive for Business site collections, in a single API. You'll be able to get the Delta query off of that, as well as webhook notifications. So if you're monitoring for new sites being created, you'll be able to subscribe to a webhook to the list, and as new sites get created, you'll get notified. We've had this as a pretty big request for a while, and we're really excited that that's going to be shipping very, very soon. So let's talk about building good apps and things you should keep in mind as you do that. It's important to think about balance in your app. Know what your app actually needs and don't request things that it doesn't. Oftentimes enumerating or expanding objects that don't come back by default from our API queries. And this applies particularly to classic APIs. So if you're looking at SharePoint REST and CSOM calls, it's very easy to ask for things you don't need or things that turn out to be very expensive. So it's important to know what information your app actually needs and only request that. As well, it's important to go as fast as you need to accomplish your task, but not excessively so. This seems like obvious information, but in a lot of cases what we found was there are apps that if you don't plan ahead, you can blast the service with a lot of requests all at the same time, and that ultimately ends up in being throttled either for your individual application or because in aggregate the entire tenancy is under load. And so you can get a 429 or a 503 throttled response if you start going too fast. And so we have produced some guidance at aka.ms/scan guidance that will help walk you through the process if you're in an app scenario that's high volume. So if you're building a back-end process that's going to operate on all the files or all of the sites in your tenancy, definitely take a look at that guidance. And it's going to walk you through how to efficiently use Delta, how to use webhooks, how to handle the throttling responses when they come back, and really help get your app into a healthy state. Planning for scale, this is kind of continuing on that theme. Parallelize your app where it makes sense. We're certainly not expecting you to have a single-threaded app that only does one request at a time. But keep in mind that doing that well takes a bit of architecture up front. So you need to think about how many threads at a time you actually want to attempt to do. The more you do, the more likely you're going to run into the throttle limit. But it's certainly doable, and we're going to have a reference application that we're going to see part of today that should give you a good pattern that you can follow for how to do that. Be ready to back off when the pipe gets full. So as I mentioned, 429s and 503s are the response. They're a fact of life. They are going to tell you in a retry after header how long you need to go away for before you can start making more requests. And in large-scale applications, it's important to note that's not just back off the current request you're making, but you need to back off all requests that your app is making. And we recognize this is a difficult problem to architect for, and so we're continuing to work on what the best guidance and if there are any kind of sample patterns we can produce that will help make that easier. But the more you do that, the more it's going to let the pipeline get clear ahead of you and be able to actually go faster because you back off more. Also, it's possible if you have an app that does many things, so you might have a back-end server component that's working on a whole lot of files at once, and you might have an interactive part that your tenant admin or a user is working with. It's okay to split those into multiple apps. If you need to register multiple apps in Azure, you're going to be totally fine just making those separate parts that you can call with different IDs. We don't recommend doing that just to avoid the throttling limit. So if you're doing a lot of work and you have 2 or 3 apps all doing a lot of work, that's not generally good. We will find out, and we will probably have an uncomfortable conversation at some point, usually between you, your customer, and us, and nobody loves that. So don't do it to avoid the throttle limit. It's better to just honor what the server is telling you, and you'll actually get more done. But if you do have a good scenario where you've got interactive and non-interactive work going on, totally okay to split that up. So let's look at some details of some of the things that I talked about earlier. We're going to talk about first how you find sites, and then we'll start going into some demos. So there's basically 3 good ways to find site collections through the API. 2 of these are new. Search is an option. Through Graph, you can search off of the site's endpoint, and you can search for sites by name, and they will come back. You're limited by the various things that search has always been limited with in terms of latency. But it is viable if you're looking for individual sites or a small set of sites to do that. Graph doesn't currently support the kind of full range of what the classic SharePoint search has done. If you heard the announcements earlier in the week about Microsoft Search, that's kind of the long-term vision for how we bring that capability into Microsoft Graph. It's going to take a while to get there, but Search is going to keep getting better. And then you can use the followed sites API, as I said, if you're looking for the sites that an individual user is following, and the new sites endpoint, which will include both SharePoint sites and OneDrive for Business site collections in the same request. For the followed sites API, we did something a little different. We actually worked with a partner on a sample app that we're going to ship. It's going to be open source code. But we were able to work with them as we were building the feature to kind of validate the scenario, validate that our sample app was working at scale as they launched. So a big thank you to Japan Railway East, who's been a great partner there. And so far, so good with that. The source code for this sample app is one A, we're going to look at in just a few seconds, and B, we'll get out to GitHub as soon as I finish writing all of the code comments that need to go into it. So like I said, let's take a look at that app and see how we can leverage the new site collection enumeration API to make that app even better. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio here. And part of what this app does is it reads in a configuration file that maps a set of Office 365 groups to the site collections that I want them to follow. So I could say, new employees at the Tokyo train station, please, you need to follow the Tokyo train station rules, the Tokyo train station schedule. However those different sites are organized, I can seed those users with that set of sites. And part of that process involves going through and actually validating that all the sites exist, because since it's a human-generated config file, it generally can have errors. So now that I have the site collection enumeration API available, I wanted to add that capability into my app. So I've got a breakpoint here we're going to hit in a minute to see what comes back. But let's take a look at what I had to do to get all of the site collections. So we're going to go to the load all site collections method here. I'm going to delete these 2 lines that I forgot to get rid of earlier, because we don't need them. This is super simple. You can see this is a dozen lines of code maybe. First thing I do is get the Graph client. So I'm using the .NET SDK for Microsoft Graph to make this easier. So I get a client back from our authentication helper library here. Once I've got that Graph client, all I have to do is execute the sites API, make a request. For this demo, because it's not shipped yet, I'm passing in a preference header. You won't have to do that when it actually gets out to the beta. And it's going to return us a paged response. Part of why we're comfortable actually exposing an API that can return all of the sites in your tenancy is that in Graph, most responses that can get large are going to return you pages of results. So we know that you've got I'm getting the screen is too small. Better? All right. Good to have my engineers in the audience. Okay, so all of these are going to return back pages of results, so it's easier for me to us efficiently on the server, and you efficiently to consume in your app. So most of this code is just this while loop that says as long as I have another page coming back in the request, go get that page, and then I'm going to append that list of sites to the ones that I've collected. So let's actually run this and see what we get back. So this is a console app. It's nothing super pretty, but it's going to run. It's going to load in our config file off of disk, and we're going to try to load all of those site collections, and we should hit the breakpoint here. And let's see what we got. So here's our master list of sites, and that is really tiny. I don't know if I can, let's see. See if we can make this bigger. Oh, maybe. Okay, that worked. Okay, so we've got our array here of all the sites. This is a pretty small tenant because it's one of our test demo tenants. But if I crack open number 10 here, we're going to see this is the SPC demo group site, and I've got its URL back here. I've got its ID, so I can now make additional graph requests against it. And it's going to have the created date time as well coming back in the data set. The rest of these items just aren't populated because the enumeration API didn't fill them out, but it's still returning a standard site object back for us to work with. So part of what we found really helpful was that even though we haven't released the API yet, the SDK generator actually had already picked up the metadata. So in the past, this API was defined, but it returned an error. The SDK is already configured to return the right data types from the API on day one, so you won't have to wait to be able to get that to work. So if we take a look at another one of the sites that comes back here, we'll look at number 5. We can see this one is running off of the -my, so this is a OneDrive for Business. So like I said, you get both OneDrive for Business and SharePoint site collections in the same list, something that wasn't possible before through any of our API endpoints really at all. So we're hoping that people find this very useful. So let's take a look. We're going to actually move on to the next demo. If I can get magnifier to go away, maybe. Where'd it go? Go. All right, let's come back over to PowerPoint. So our next demo, we looked at all site collections. Now let's take a look at the following part. So there's a couple different parts here. The app we were just using uses follows to seed data for employees. But in the past, I've done a bunch of demos where I build a SharePoint framework Webpart that is able to pick from lists, but not from site collections. So I could generally write a Webpart that works on the current page, but not really helpful anywhere else. Let me just see if I can get the zoom in here. There we go. So I've got a Webpart built here with just pretty basic. Created the new project a couple days ago. And what I want to do is when the property pane configuration starts, I want to actually go out using Graft to pull back the list of site collections that the user's following. I'm going to put those in a drop-down, and when you pick from that first drop-down, then we're going to populate the list of lists that are available on that site collection. So I can now target with my Webpart rendering which site I actually want to work against. So let's take a look at this Initialize site collections. And what we're going to do is within SharePoint Framework, I've got the Graft JavaScript SDK already included for me. So I didn't have to do anything other than import a couple things at the top of the file. And now I can use the MS Graph client factory to get a client. And once that comes back, I can make an API request. And in this case, I'm going to ask for me followed sites. So whoever the user is that's rendering this page, I want their list of sites. So I'm going to get kind of personalized, targeted results here. In this case, I'm asking for beta API. And when it comes back, I'm just going to push that list into an array. And then I'm going to tell it to go make a graph call to get the lists. So let's see what that looks like in action. Let's come over. Ooh, that's not helpful. Never seen that before. Let's open that up again. We're going to load up our demo site, which has a page on it. I'm going to log in. And I had to make sure to memorize this so that I don't have to worry about accidentally showing you what the password is. All right, so let's get our site loaded. Let's go look at a page that I've got created here with that sample Webpart. Here we go. Let's go into edit mode. And we can see our rendering's not all that interesting at the moment, but let's come into the configuration panel. And I've got two drop-downs here on the right, the target site collection and the target document library. And you can see as soon as that data came back, we refreshed the property pane. And now I've got the list of all the site collections that this user is following, so I can make this web part actually relevant to them. And so this is pretty cool. As I switch through here, it's going to re-query and repopulate the list down below. In this case, I know that I actually want the one that I had originally configured. I want the sample audio library. And that's all working. So not a whole lot of work to get that query to come back. It's all pretty standard SharePoint framework stuff. So if you look at our SharePoint framework samples, there are good guides on how to work with the property pane. Adding this call to be able to get the site collections from followed was pretty easy. So let's go back over to our deck. So we've got picking a site collection done. Now that I've done that, let's look at what it would take on the server to actually do something interesting to maybe populate that web part. So webhooks are a great way to get notified when your application needs to know that something happened. So there's kind of two flavors here. There's traditional webhooks. Pay no attention to the age of the phone on the left. It's really just a metaphor for it's going to call you when there's an answer. These are great for service-to-service integrations. And so we're going to look at how we build a web API in a minute to do that. And as I said before, you can use a preference header now to get the ACL change related webhooks firing. We also support Socket.io. If you're doing client integrations, you can configure Socket.io to make that work. Same basic model, you're going to get a notification when something interesting happens, but that integration is also shipped generally available as well. All right, so let's go back into code, because that's where I like to be. So we're going to look at how webhooks work, and something that we don't usually show in our demos, which is how to do a persistent cache. So in a lot of our online samples, we have a bunch of comments in the code that say, you probably want to persist this somewhere if you're doing a real scenario. I found that a little frustrating because I didn't know what it would take to make that work. So I'm actually going to show you what it takes to make a persistent cache for webhooks. The reason you want to do that is so that when you're building your application, you don't have to worry about continuing to lose the information every time it starts up. So we're going to start out, webhooks have two basic components. We have a subscription, which is our registration with Graft that we want to be notified, and we have a notification that comes back. So what I've done is I've created a web API project that lives in Azure, and it has just a few endpoints that are there for a client to talk to my API and my API to talk to Graft back. So if we look at the top here, I've defined a few endpoints. I can tell my web API to go talk to Graft and return the list of webhook subscriptions that I have. And that's useful for diagnostics, but not the meat really of what we want to do. I can get an individual response here from a GET. But the one we mainly want to look at is this post here. This is what actually does the subscription to Graph. So like we've done in our other sample, we have a helper function that returns us a Graph service client from the .NET SDK. First example we saw working in a .NET Core console app. Now we've got a .NET Core web API up sitting in Azure, so it scales across all the different project types that you might be working with. So I'm going to define a new subscription. I take some input from the body, which basically says what tenant I want to connect to, what endpoint I need to hit. So when I create that notification and send it over to Graph, I'm going to pass a few bits of information. For OneDrive and SharePoint, we only support the updated change type. So other workloads might support different verbs like added or deleted. We only support updated as the verb, but we will return you events based on all different conditions. So updated is what I always want to pass here. The notification URL is the URL of my web API that's going to receive the webhook notification later. And so we're going to look at that code in a minute. The resource is which drive I want to configure. And we'll see that. I'm going to use Postman in a minute to hit this endpoint, and we'll see what it passes along. But that's the drive ID that I actually want to hit. And then client state is just a unique value that I can pass along to the server so that I can validate when it comes back that it's really the one that I subscribe to. So I won't get spoofed by someone else, or if I accidentally got a notification for another app, I would know that this is my client state. In this case, that happened to be the name of the band I was listening to when I was coding this up. So it doesn't matter what the string is, it's arbitrary as long as you have it saved somewhere to compare later. So once we have that, we also set an expiration time. Maximum expiration time right now is 7 days. We're working on extending that, but for now it's 7 days. And you can re-up for 3 additional days if you do a renew. So in this case, we can figure out if a client already gave me an ID, then I know to do an update rather than an add. But the call to Graph is just to the subscriptions endpoint. I create a request, I make an add, and I pass in that little bit of data I defined up above. Once I get that back, the server is actually going to give me some info back about that subscription. I'm going to put it into a cache. So I created a useful sample class here, and I'm hoping to get this sample also published to GitHub, that is a Cosmos DB backed Azure SQL cache that reads and writes information. And this is a little bit of code here that does some basic CRUD operations on these things. And I templatized it so I could use it both for my subscriptions that we're doing right now, and as we'll see in a little bit later, also for the Delta API for tokens that it returns. So this code, I'm not going to walk through it all because it's pretty straightforward. And like I said, I'm going to try to get the sample released. Part of what I did here was to leverage Azure Key Vault, which is another great service. So I don't actually have to encode my database connection strings, my other client secrets that I wouldn't feel comfortable publishing to GitHub. I don't have to put them in my source code. I can simply request them from Azure Key Vault. And I can set up Azure Key Vault to talk to my app using Azure identities to make that work. If you're interested in that, there's great documentation online for how to make apps work with Key Vault. It didn't take me more than a day to get it all set up, including the database connections. So Cosmos DB, for those that don't know, takes an unstructured set of data, and so I can write whatever I need to into the tables fairly easily. I didn't have to do a lot of schema setup up front. I could just write the code and have it write and read from it. So in here we've got a create the table if it doesn't exist. We've got an add item to the cache. We've got get item from the cache because we're going to need that. And then we've got delete item. So that's really all I need to have a persistent cache. The benefit of that persistence is that every time I'm debugging and restarting the web app, I'm not losing track of my subscriptions, and I don't always have to go back to Graph. I can go to Azure instead, and it saves a little bit of perf just in terms of a quick read-write for some of that information. So we talked about the subscription side. So when I make that subscription call, when I post to Graph and say, I want to subscribe, it's going to immediately turn around and give me a notification. That notification is a check that I have to respond to immediately that says, yep, I got it, I'm here, don't throw that away. So we can see I've got that listen endpoint, which is what I passed in when I made the subscription. When we come in here, if the validation token parameter is passed, I'm just going to immediately return it back and say, yep, I got it, we're all good, please keep sending me notifications. If I didn't get that, then it means it's a real notification. The trick with notifications is you want to respond to the server with a 200, or a 202 rather, as soon as possible. Because if you don't, then it will start retrying, and you'll start getting more notifications. So you'll actually notice this as you're building a service, that if you're sitting here in the debugger wondering why something up above doesn't work, you might start getting re-entrant because you'll get a whole bunch more notifications backed up because you forgot to send the 202. So what we do and what we recommend as the pattern is basically do nothing in the actual code that's listening. So I listen, I read in the input that the server is giving me about that notification, and then I just queue up an asynchronous task that's going to go take as much time as it wants But as soon as I've parsed that out and added that task, I'm going to return the status code 202. Even if my code is ultimately going to fail and I'm going to want an exception, I'm going to return the 202 back to Graft so that it doesn't keep retrying, which is really important. So let's take a look at Postman, and we'll see how that works. So I have a quick bit here that's going to subscribe to the webhook. So if we look, I'm not going to run the magnifier again because that was a little risky and I kind of blew up the browser. So trust me when this says it's hitting the API subscription endpoint in the bit that's highlighted there. And I'm going to pass in just a little bit of information. I'm passing an application JSON as the content type header. And in the body, I'm just passing an empty ID, the tenant I want to subscribe to, and the URL of the resource I'm doing. Now, I happen to know ahead of time that this is the same ID for that drive that we configured in the previous sample using the picker. Ideally, I would actually make a call over to this endpoint using that value and do that automatically. But it was easier to show what happens using Postman here. So I can send that request. It's going to hit my web API, which is in turn going to hit Graph and tell it wants a subscription. And we're going to get a response here any second. It's working. There we go. And the body that it returns just has some of that same basic information I gave it, but it gives me an ACK that that subscription is set up. So if we were to go start uploading files into that library, we could actually watch the webhooks fire, but we're going to come back to that in a minute after we do the next section, which is about how we actually get those changes once we've got notifications. So for now, we've got our webhook subscribed, so that drive, whenever a file gets uploaded, we're going to see a notification. And we're going to come back over to PowerPoint. So I get a notification. What do I actually do with it? Well, the thing that I typically want to do in most cases is find changes. As you can see, my pie changes from full to mostly eaten. So delta query is the equivalent of finding out how much of that pie I ate, which is usually too much. Delta query is going to return you the set of things that have changed. That's really basically what it does. There are a couple things you can pass in as preference headers that will modify that behavior. First, you can pass a flag called Hierarchical Sharing, and what this will do is it will only return you permissions information on items that have unique permissions. So if you think about the way a lot of SharePoint sites are architected, you probably only have unique permissions at the top level. Like your site collection is probably a top, and then maybe you've got some individual document libraries that might be permissioned differently. But in many, many, many cases, you don't have item level permissions that you need to track. And if you don't understand what that hierarchy looks like, you end up having to ask for everything's permissions because we return them to you, and that gets costly. So this hierarchical sharing value will only return you permissions nodes on ones that are unique. So you know if that appears, then you can query for an item's permissions, and if not, you're probably safe to ignore it. The other header that goes along with that is the one I talked about at the beginning, which is delta show sharing changes. That's a bit of a tongue twister. This will return back an annotation on things that changed because of ACL changes. So again, this was delta usually returns you just the current state and doesn't tell you a whole lot about what its previous state was, because the database really only knows the current one. But in this case, we're actually adding this flag so that you can determine that permissions are the thing you care about. You can go back and query for them. You're going to want to send both. If you're using those headers, you send them both with your initial delta as well as with the follow-ups. And so we're going to look at delta code in a second, and that will become clear if you're not familiar with delta what that really means. But you're going to want to send it both on the initial delta as well as any subsequent calls you make to get changes. So we'll go back over to our code. And we've looked at our subscriptions and our notifications, so let's go over to this helper class I have that does the real work. And I have this method that is get files to render. And we'll see what that means once the demo all comes together. But ultimately what I want to do is find out which files got uploaded so that I can go do the business logic that I want to execute on it. So this is pretty easy. I'm going to get the Graph client again. I need to know what target resource I'm hitting because OneDrive and SharePoint have slightly different paths in the API. So this is a little method or a class I wrote that all it does is split out the drive ID and the site ID. Again, I'm going to try to get all this sample code up on GitHub so you can steal it, use it, make your apps better. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to that same persistent cache we were using before. So before I used it for subscriptions, now I'm using it for the Delta token. Whenever I call Delta for the first time, it's going to return me back a new URL that says what to call back with to get just the changes since that last time. So in order to efficiently use Delta, I don't want to call for the full list every time. I just want to know what changed. So I need to save that link off so that I can call it again. And same situation as with the subscriptions. I don't want it to go away every time I restart my app. So I persisted into the same Cosmos DB. That class is templated, so it, like I said, Cosmos DB is unstructured data, so it's going to just take this token. So if I have a cached value, then I get its token value out. If not, I can just pass the empty string as the token, and it's the same as if I didn't specify a token value at all. And so here, depending on whether if I have a site identifier and a drive identifier, I know I'm in SharePoint. If I only have a drive identifier, I know I'm in OneDrive for Business. But the calls that I make here to Delta are basically the same other than an additional path parameter here. So I call the root element of the drive, and then I ask for Delta, and I pass in that token value. And what I get back, just like with the subscriptions, is going to be a page. So we're going to keep going and loop through all of the next page requests that come back and add those to our results. And at the end, after getting all of the pages, it'll be on the first page if I only have one page of results. I'm going to get an @odata.delta link. This is the thing that I now want to shove in my database so that I can call it later the next time I get items. And I do this per drive. So if I'm subscribed to many drives, I'm going to get a different Delta token per drive so that I know what the changes on that drive are. So that's part of the information that I persist off is which drive that subscription goes for. And then when that comes back, I'm just going to loop through all the files that it gave, and I'm going to have this render method. So let's actually see this in practice. So we've got webhooks are going to fire, Delta I'm going to call and get the files list. We've seen code, now let's see what this looks like in practice. So I'm going to switch over to my phone because doing mobile demos is always fun and exciting. And I don't know if you noticed, but my sample scenario here is Contoso Synthesizers. And as the only member of the Contoso Synthesizers team, I've been attempting to learn electronic music production. So we can see I've been working this week on this track, and we're going to groove out a little bit. Okay, so been working on that here at the conference, so there's my song. And I'm actually going to take this and upload that to OneDrive, or to SharePoint. So we're going to save it out. We're going to render this file. I'm going to pick the OneDrive app for sharing. I'm going to switch over to the demo account and find the library in the Synthesizers team. And I've got a folder here, sample audio, which is the same folder that we've subscribed our webhooks to. So I'm going to hit upload. And we're going to switch over to the OneDrive app. Audio that already uploaded. So now all we're waiting for is our webhook to fire. It can take a minute or so for the webhook to fire, but when it does, our business logic is going to run. Oh, there we go. We got it already. That was real quick. So you can see I've now got this wave renders folder, and inside is a PNG file that our business logic that I didn't walk through generated. And I could show you what that looks like, but we've got one more section to go, so we're going to see that at the end, what this actually generated as a result of our webhook and Delta call. So if I had uploaded multiple files, I would be able to see all of them, all of the results in this folder. So let's switch back over. Let's go back to our deck and talk about integrating components. So I didn't have a great title for this because it covers a pretty broad section. But in general, you can integrate with the API, which is great, but you really need a host for doing it, and sometimes you want to actually take our UX components and bring them into your app. So SharePoint Framework, great way to build integrations into SharePoint. As you've heard throughout the week, these work on SharePoint pages. You can build them as Teams tabs. You can build them as app pages in SharePoint now if you have a full page experience that you're trying to provide. So SharePoint Framework, great option for actually building an integration. We saw that with the picker that or the site collection picker that we built earlier. We have a file picker control, so that's what's pictured here on the right. This component allows you to pick files from OneDrive or SharePoint. You can use it for both open and for saving files. This component is available as a JavaScript library that you can integrate into your apps. And just recently, we've added support for sovereign cloud configurations. So previously, this was hard-coded to work against the primary graph endpoint. But if you're working in a sovereign cloud configuration now, you can make the file picker target that endpoint as well, which is really helpful if you happen to be in one of those regions or working with a customer who's in one of those regions. We also have released, I believe, I'm going to look at the engineering manager, in beta, right? Beta file browser control. So the same view of OneDrive and SharePoint that is featured throughout all of our user experience is now hostable within yours. So you can get this as an NPM package. It is not quite fully featured in terms of all the bells and whistles. That's a conscious choice right now in the way that we've put that configuration together, but we're going to keep expanding on that over time. But it's available as an NPM package that you can integrate into your own experiences, and that's a great way if you have need of just navigating the folder structure or letting your users see what's in a particular spot integrated into your line of business app. You can integrate that. And then we also have a previews API. So this API has been available for a while, but the previews API allows you to get a URL that will instantiate the OneDrive previewer for any of the 320 file types that we support for files that are living in OneDrive and SharePoint. So whatever the file type is, we can use the previewer to actually integrate that. Yep. I don't believe so, but if you get me afterwards, we can accost the developer who owns the API sitting in the back, and we can find out for sure. So let's do our last demo here, which we're going to take two of those components that we just talked about. So we're going to take our Webpart that we were working on before, so that's SharePoint Framework, and we're going to use the Previews API, which I don't really need to because I know that I generated an image, but imagine this was a more complex file type that we got from our webhook. And we're going to actually host the OneDrive previewer inside of an iframe in my SharePoint Framework Webpart. So I'm going to uncomment this line that's going to get the data, and let's take a look at the query that we're actually going to make here. I've got my Webpart configured, because we saw that earlier. I've got a target site collection and a target list. So I know that I can generate the URL that I want. So we can see I've got sites, the target site collection, lists, the target document library. I want the items. And when I use the JavaScript client for Graph, I'm going to expand the fields, because I actually want to get some of the column data back that I can work with. So I expand the fields in my request. And when it comes back, I'm going to actually use that. One thing that I didn't show earlier, let's open up that sample audio folder, is part of what we did after the Delta call came in is I actually wrote into the waveform column here a drive ID or drive item ID of that Jape, of the output file that we generated. So I can look for my original file, find its associated PNG file, and we're going to render that. So let's go over here. So I do that by generating this string. So I've got sites, lists. I know what drive item I want because I'm pulling that column from the item fields. It's called waveform URL internally. The display string for that column is waveform. And then I just call the preview endpoint. When I call preview, I'm actually doing a post. So I do a post to the preview endpoint, and it's going to return me an authenticated URL that I can use in the iframe to render out that previewer. The API requires a value, so you can't pass null into the post, otherwise it blows up. So I'm passing the empty string. It's not required for the API to have a value, but the SDK requires it. And so let's take a look. After I get the preview, I save off that URL, and in our render code for this slick React carousel that I'm using, I get an individual slide, and all I'm going to do is create an iframe right here. I'm going to pass in what came back from the API as my result. So let's go over. We're going to save this. We're going to watch. Gulp's going to go. So I've got the Gulp task for SharePoint Framework running in the background here. It's compiling the code after I hit the save button. That's gone up there. So if we come over here, save as draft, that'll re-render the page. It's going to take it a second. Maybe. Oh. Refresh the page. There we go. And it's actually going out. So it's gone out to the library. It's looked for all the files. It's found their associated images. And what we see here is when our webhook fired and Delta query went, I actually generated the visualization of the music file that we uploaded off my phone. So we've got the actual visualization here running in the OneDrive previewer. If this had been some other more interesting file type than just PNG, I'd get that here too, any of the 320 that OneDrive and SharePoint support. But yeah, pretty slick that I can do that all within my SharePoint Framework Webpart. And again, now I don't have to write my own file viewer because I can use the preview API to get that integrated into my application. So I thought that was pretty slick. Thanks. So let's wrap up and recap. We started out talking about architecting for efficiency. Use the scan guidance if you're doing high volume apps. It's going to help you get the right architecture on the first try. We've got great options now, or will very soon, as soon as the betas ship, for finding the sites you need. We've got search, follows, the sites endpoint that we all saw working today. You can handle changes reactively, so webhooks and Socket.io for notifications, Delta query to get the changes, and as mentioned but not demoed, we've got a lot of options for permissions handling if you're writing something that needs to know how those all work. And we've got a lot of great options for integrating those with your experience as well. So SharePoint Framework, the file picker and browser control, which both use Graph on the back end, and the Previews API for integrating the OneDrive UX and the SharePoint UX right in. So thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take those. I know it's the end of the conference, but there's a ton of other developer sessions that have gone on throughout the week, and I think a few more still to come, maybe this afternoon, maybe not. Great community sessions also, so when the deck goes up, you can comb through here and find the ones you may have missed. But thank you very much.